everybody. Hope you enjoyed part one of this two-part series with the interview with Dan Roman from the National Geodetic Survey. Here's part two. Enjoy the rest of this. Again, let us know what you think down in the comments. Looking forward to hearing what you have to say. Yes. What have you seen inside your agency? Is it just people growing old in the position, or have people left and gone back and forth, or how does it play out?
They get old in the position and they retire.
Gotcha.
We're down 30 positions. We are literally down 30 bodies.
Oh, wow.
And it is, part of it is, for a long period of time, it was static budgets.
Yep.
So, they're like, sure, you get a 2 or 3% pay raise, but you didn't get it plus up in the money. So that means you really had to basically not hire somebody, take that money, divvy it up. So everybody got a 2 to 3% pay raise and a 2 to 3% work raise.
Yeah.
Because you have to share the load amongst less people.
Exactly.
And eventually that tally starts to become problematic. And the other side of it is it becomes more difficult to hire in qualified people. I mean, because there's no programs. So you spend a lot of time. I mean, we're almost eating our seed corn. We hired Dan Gillens, former professor at the Oregon State University. We just hired, I'm trying to remember his name. We just hired somebody else in from Arizona, another professor that is no longer teaching students. And, what are you going to do? I mean, it's like I said, we're eating our seed corn because right now, all of the academics who could potentially be training our people out there are not available. They're not, we're hiring them and they're not actually out teaching new people what to do.
Right.
Rick Bennett, sorry, that was who I was trying to think of. Rick used to teach as a professor down at Arizona or Arizona State. I can't recall which, but he's not teaching there anymore. That's the one thing I do know. So that's another professor who's gone. I mean, we're slowly, we pluck them out. Sometimes they do roll out. We had Chris Pearson who went out. He was teaching at Otago, but that was in New Zealand. I was a little jealous of him about that one. But and then another one went off to Chris Parrish, who went off to, I think he was at Maine for a while or up in the New England area. And I think he's off at Oregon State now. Oh. But you send some of them go back out. But again, there's really not new people coming in. It's the same people kind of trading around. Some go out, some come in, but we're not gaining. We have had some success bringing in, generally we'll bring in like surveyors, somebody with a surveying background. And we just finished sending Amy Wetter. We sent her off for advanced training at Scripps. She's learned something about Geodesy and INSAR and deformation monitoring and all those types of things and pulling that all together so that she can come back and take that advanced training and apply that within the spatial reference system division. But it's Wednesdays, Tuesdays, and we're bringing in people we're not bringing in people at the master's or PhD level with a degree in geodesy because there are none to be had.
Yep.
And that's the problem is we need to reinvigorate those programs. And by I'm thinking, I mean, it would be nice if we were a granting organization, but the other side of that is then there's a lot of overhead and work that has to be done to be a granting organization in terms of funding those types of things. NASA's already structured for it. NASA can set a lot of this up, but as long as we enter into an agreement, if we have a national plan, NGA and NGS and NASA and USGS, anybody who has a need for some type of geodesist to come on to staff, as long as we can play in it peripherally, if we can say, here's some good research projects that these people that are going through these programs can focus on, they are going to meet mission needs for the US government writ large. And then those people get trained on things, they learn about our program, and then when they graduate, they need a job. Go on down. Now you've been trained, you've got a degree in geodesy, you've got the background and already what our program does, and you can walk in the door a full up round and you can get off the ground running a lot faster than trying to retrain somebody who's maybe a surveyor. Yep. Nothing against surveyors, but they're not geodesists per se. They don't have that background necessarily. Right. And they have to learn a lot of new skills to come up to speed, to be useful within the agency. And that becomes something of a problem because it puts a lot of burden on them and the agency to do that. And we just don't have the depth, in the pockets, if you will, but the depth on the bench either to go and do stuff like that. We need to have an external mechanism set up, structured across the whole of government, something where there's a concerted effort that can then turn around and feed into this, and that we could reasonably draw off some of those people and in positions of research and development within the National Geodetic Survey.
Right. And
I'm
that's,
sure plenty will go into NASA and USGS and NGA as well.
mhm.
And I'm glad for that too. And we will continue we have agreements with them and we'll continue to build a national program, but we are collectively looking to try and find a mechanism, be it some type of interagency agreements or something that structures this. But in the end, it's going to come down to funding. We need somebody to get the funding to get these programs stood up at these universities so that they start to train people in the right skill sets to send back out. And presumably the universities will take a focus on trying to get at the diversity issue, because that is very much a focus for a lot of the universities. We will too, in terms of the hiring, because it's one thing if the universities are diverse and bringing their populations in, and then we suddenly are picky and choosy about who we hire. We have to be equally diverse and make sure we're bringing in a robust selection of students to become new FTEs for National Geodetic Survey, for all the other government agencies, to get that broad spectrum of ideas and backgrounds so that we can do an even better job into the future.
Well, and I think, I think that brings up a great point. And also, just one thing I wanted to add to it is I think that's always been the beauty of the sciences, albeit we've been very monochromatic in the sciences up until the recent history. This day and age, the way that more people have approached it, the more educated people, and albeit I'm not speaking in every situation, but when you know the science, that's the most important thing. It doesn't matter what you look like, where you come from, your background, da 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 da. Some of well, in geology, I'm sure you know this from your geologic background, if you did any of the history, 90% of anything that changed the history of geology never came from somebody who is a geologist. You have William Smith doing the first map in New England, or in England, and he was a land surveyor that just noticed these rocks were different because the Royal Geologic Society was all these old guys sitting in a room just talking about how the maps work and how things work. And I think that's a fascinating part. And that's where I would love to see the diversity of it, because the more perspectives you bring in, the more understandings and the more backgrounds you bring into it, the better the science gets, the better the conversation gets. And the more people like you and I, when we sit down for a beer with somebody or something like that, the more engaging it gets too, because it's the science is driving the conversation. It really leaves everything else out. The other fun part about geology, like when I first took the coursework back in uni, they said this is the only field where you will never talk about anything else other than rocks, because rocks don't care about people, they don't care about events, they don't care about things, they care about themselves and how they change. And on a geologic time frame, your sandstones, your mudstones, and everything are essentially a fluid across all these hard rocks. Ergo, it has nothing to do with humanism. There's nothing anthropomorphic about it. So, and I think that's the fun about geodesy. The Earth's going to do what it does, and it's going to move how it moves, and the gravitational field is what it is. So we either get better at understanding how it does it, or we don't, and that's up to us. And like you were saying, the difference between pulling in the boat easy or running a car off into a sidewalk.
Yep, I know. Well, I talk about it with regard to weather and all the other things. The geoid's a good example. The geoid has to be extended across national boundaries.
Yep.
Because we need to understand how water is going to behave, not just on our side of the border, but on the other side of the border too.
Right.
Hurricanes don't know national boundaries. A hurricane that comes up and is going to barrel into Mexico and into Texas is going to dump water on both sides.
Exactly.
Whether you measure in meters on one side and feet on the other, you better be able to put them all together, and you better figure out where that basin of water, where the water's coming down and where it's going, because otherwise you're going to have a mess.
Exactly.
And the Earth does not care about any human assumptions, limitations, or issues. That's your problem. Exactly. Mother Nature can be very unforgiving.
Exactly.
So, and I agree. And diversity of opinions is definitely what we need. Get some better ideas and move it forward a little bit.
Right. And so what would be for the future students that want to go be a geometrician and surveyor, and they want to go on to be a geodesist because they love the math side of it and they just ate up linear algebra? What would be a reasonable salary for them to expect? And it doesn't have to be like exact numbers. It could be a range.
Understood. I think entering in, well, speaking from our point of view, I mean, we'll typically hire GS 7 to 9. I think 9's more typical for like a bachelor's. And those are going to be about in the DC area, at least. I'm speaking here because there's a cost of living, but it's probably not that much scaled too much differently for the rest of the country. But you're in the $60,000 to $80,000 range, I think, entering.
Okay.
And then as you start to advance and you get like a master's or a PhD, you start to move up to um, the equivalents of like a 12, 13, maybe 14. Now you're starting to move up into the $150,000 range as you get
Okay.
up to really the top end. I, we're just so you know too, we're under pay for performance in
Yep.
commerce, and so I'm not a GS15, I'm a ZP5.
Oh, you moved to the ZP system. Okay. So,
Okay, so yeah, and I'm a professional system, but
yep.
a ZP5 is equivalent to a GS15. A ZP4 is equivalent to a GS13, 14. But the pay scales are, I mean, other than they're kind of moving around a little bit, the pay scales are still nominally the same. And GS15, like I said, that's the top end of that's like 180,000, but that's when you're capped out. And that's usually you're like in my position. You've been here for 20 years.
Yep.
You're a senior scientist or a division chief or somebody in a position of authority. So that's your high end. Beyond that, though, you have a lot of GS14s, 13 equivalents. The ZP4s are typically going to be your high end people that have been around 15 to 20 years,
Yep.
but are more focused on, they might be branch chiefs. There are plenty that are branch chiefs. And if you're in a position of authority, that nominally you get a little bit of a pay bump. But if you're just doing research because you like research, and don't get me wrong, for 15 years, I did research. I avoided being a branch chief or anything like that because I was the geoid team lead and I loved it.
Yeah.
But I also recognize that sooner or later, you eventually you're going to rise to a position where you have to take on leadership.
Yep.
And that's naturally enough, those positions take on a little more pay, but there's a lot more responsibility what goes with them. But again, a 13, 14 is not inconceivable. And in the DC area, you're talking 120, 130, maybe $140,000 range.
Which is a good livable. I mean, I don't know cost of living
In
directly.
DC, I don't know.
Well,
You
but I
get
mean,
paid lower because it's a cost of living. You get paid less maybe in some other areas,
yeah.
but your cost of living is a heck of a lot lower too.
Yeah.
But that said, it's still a decent wage. And if you're married or even if you're single, and you're living in town, and it's a decent wage. I'm
It's
able
enough to
to
get by.
support.
You're
It
not
is.
you're not working two jobs, going to a restaurant at night and picking up a wait
Yeah,
staff
yeah, that's
job.
right.
Well,
Not moonlighting as a busboy.
and I think that's a huge thing to, in this area, just to show that, well, here's the applicability from a bachelor's degree. When I came out of geology with a bachelor's degree, I was promised 60 to 80,000, and then everyone had their master's because it was also the 2008 crash. So the 60 to $80,000 jobs went to those folks. We got paid 40 to maybe 50, and that was being nice. Much like you see in the biologic field, where they go out and it's a nonprofit that they work for 32,000 for the first 10 years. To know that if you go all the way through, you make it past that linear algebra, and you could go into geodesy and come out at 60 to 80,000. I mean, I might even consider doing that again.
Well, I'll tell you too. I mean, back in '99 when I joined, I think I looked back, I saw my salary was like 37,000 a year. That was hired in as a GS11.
Yep.
Because they hired you in 11 track 13 because the idea is they were just, if you stuck around, you passed the probationary periods, they promoted you up to 13. But then that's it. I stayed there for quite a while, and then I moved up to 14, many years later. But that was a decent pay range. But yeah, back in '99, GS11 earned 37,000 with a PhD.
Yep.
But that gets back to what we talked about before. You better do it because you're passionate if you want the PhD.
Yeah.
You better be passionate about it because you're not going to come out. If I had to come out years before with my master's, I would have been past that easily, by the time I got to 1999. But that's what I wanted to do, and I did.
It's the love of learning.
I'm not regretting.
Yeah, that's it. And right there with you, it took me forever to get my bachelor's degree because I just wanted to keep taking courses. I wanted to figure out what I wanted to do. I was a language major, I was a biology major, I was a geology major. And I stuck with geology because it was the most fascinating, and I got to go outside.
Yep.
and drink beer. Weirdly enough, it was synonymous.
Yeah, there's a lot of that in that culture. That's part of the culture.
Yeah. So
I think there's some wine nowadays, but
exactly, you just get good at it. We already know how you got your job. If you could start it all over again, would you? And would you do something differently?
Yeah, I'd study linear algebra before I went to OSU.
Well, so yeah, we know.
Boy, that was a hard semester, or a hard quarter. It really was. But yeah, and the thing is I got out in like February, so I had spring and summer. didn't think, with how serious they were about it. But when I go back and look, they were very adamant. They're like, you really should have linear algebra before you show up here.
Right.
And programming. I have the programming down, and yeah, you needed programming. Fortran.
Hey, well, Fortran is the grandfather to most of our languages today. So that's sometimes it's better to know the root language than it is to know the languages of today, because when they change or they go by the wayside, guess what? Fortran still is there, or you have the base.
Yeah, that's right. The original code is still written in Fortran that you now have to put into yet another language.
Actually, you'd appreciate this. We had I used to work with a coworker who had probably about 30 years on me. And when I was a student paraprofessional for the Minnesota Pollution Control Agency, anyway, he takes a bunch of cards and puts them on my desk and says, I need this data off this by about 3 o'clock today. Mind you, we're in what, 2008, 9-ish?
That's something.
Well, exactly. And I'm sitting here just like, I don't even know if we have a machine that would read that in here. And he goes, you know what these are? And I was like, I do, because I love old technology. So I'm one of those nerds. Anyway, he goes, do you think the other intern does? And I was like, I don't think so. So I took it over to her desk and put it on her desk and said, I need these by 3 o'clock today for Brian. And she was sweating tacks. She was almost to the point of tears at 2:30, freaking out that she didn't know what to do with these things. Right. And I was like, oh, did you drop them or anything like that? She goes, well, I moved a few around. And I was like, oh my God, you threw off the program. I'm like, how are we going to do this? Anyway, it was probably the most fun I've ever had at the cost of somebody else's emotion. But it was funny to see, because it's, you see the floppy disk, right? Kids today think, why'd you print a 3D picture of the save sign? And it's like, well, it's a floppy disk, and not the original 8-inch, but the
Yeah.
Yeah.
I know. And that's exactly it. And I remember when I took my first intro programming course, it was like 82 or 83. Yep. And that was exactly it. They had it all digital at that point, but they made us do one where we had to take a box of cards and we had to run it in. We had to program it on the cards.
Yep.
That's how old school I am. But thankfully that was only one program, and it was a real simple one. The box was still this big.
Right. Well, and I think the funny thing is when you see the old technology, like the old GPS antennas from Trimble and everything, and there were these massive things that were, like 2 foot by 2 foot squares. When I worked for another company, I wanted to hang them up as decoration in my office, because people would always ask, what the hell is that? And it's like, this is how we used to do GPS. Imagine hauling this out to the survey site. One person carries the antenna head, the other person carries the tripods and everything else, or you're making multiple trips. So
yeah, I know.
You're right.
All right, what else then?
So what educational preparation would you recommend for somebody in this field that wants to go into geodesy?
Definitely, like I said, I'm not kidding about the linear algebra, because geodesy in particular, yep, it'll get into least squares adjustments if it follows the curriculum that like we used to. And quite honestly, almost everything you're going to want to do is going to involve least squares adjustments. It'll be anything from receiving all the geometric signals. It's all about taking a volume of data, processing it to try and pull out some coherent signal out of it. And invariably some form of least squares adjustments.
Right.
And linear algebra fully underpins that. And if you already have the linear algebra in your back pocket, programming in your back pocket, you understand the whole logic flow of things, then you're in pretty decent shape. Wouldn't hurt to have some engineering, if you will, understanding signals. Particularly from the geometric side of things, you want to look at geodesy and from the geometric side, and you need to understand something about signals, how they can be degraded by the ionosphere, the troposphere. Just having maybe some of those types of courses, at least an understanding of signal propagation and degradation, things that could affect signals, then you have a better chance of understanding those adjustment problems, because you're going to, again, it's observation equations. I have this observation. I receive these signals from this satellite to this receiver, but here are all the unknowns, my position, X, Y, Z, and uncertainties in it, plus all these errors that may be due to the atmosphere, the troposphere, whatever. Yep. And then you have a series of these observations that you have to stack. And you get your observation equation, and then you have to perform the adjustment, the least squares adjustments, to try and solve them. So understanding that really is kind of fundamental. But understanding all of those effects, those things that you might be solving for. I mean, that's one aspect of GPS nowadays that we've kind of been exploring it, but touching on it. It might be coming back around to where it's in vogue again, is GPS Met. You can sit there, and one man's trash is another man's treasure. To me, all that damn noise that's in between me and the satellites, it's interfering with my positioning on the ground. I need to know where I am, and all this is in the way.
Yep.
but the stuff that's in the way is due to the weather.
Exactly.
And then, gee, the National Weather Service might like to know something about all those cells and the hydrology or whatever's going on in the atmosphere in any given location and across the whole country in space and time. Yeah, they would love to know that. So that's the kind of thing. It's being able to recognize those sources, maybe being able to extract them and provide them to somebody else, and in so doing, then provide additional value in terms of the work that you're doing. I'm not just providing geodetic control so that people can go out and do cadastral surveys. I'm also helping figure out where the weather is, so that maybe figure out where the tornadoes are coming.
Exactly. Well, I
feed that in.
It's funny that you brought that up, because one of my favorite times in the field, when I was out there just being a geomatician collecting GPS stuff for a university, a gentleman from UNAVCO just pulled up his kayak and started talking to me about, oh, with your transmission signal, it's going through clouds, and we can calculate densities from the time series of that, signal from the satellite to the receiver head. And my mind was blown. I already knew a lot about the industry, but I didn't know that much about the industry. And it's the fun of getting your hands on the equipment. It's the fun of going out there and doing it. The linear algebra side, not so fun, but it prepares your mind. Well, Louis Pasteur's quote, right? Chance favors a prepared mind. If you know what's at play, you can better put the picture together, no matter what way you're looking at it or what question you're asking of it.
And you got a better chance of resolving it too. If you already have a understanding of all the things that might affect it and how you can go about processing it and separating out all the variables, then you got a better chance of also looking at it and go, does this seem reasonable? Because that's the other part. The one part that's the art that doesn't go away is being able to look at the results and go, that makes sense, or something's not right.
Something's off.
Something's off. Exactly. And sometimes it's just a gut feeling, but sometimes you look at it and go, that doesn't seem correct. Something here seems there's some sort of a hiccup. Sometimes it's nice to have an outside, some other metric to compare to, be it a former, you've occupied this position before, and gee, it's showing that you're a meter or two off from where you were before, and you're like, what happened?
Right.
But sometimes it's, it's cloudy, and there's storm cells, and all of those are affecting the signals that I'm receiving. And you know what? Maybe it's really a matter of processing some of the source of this error out, and I may be able to resolve the position and actually get the accurate position and update it, but also have some of this extra information that might be useful to other people.
Well, I think
the weather people.
The fun part is when you get a new surveyor that for the first time sees angle of incidence error when their mirror or their glass is turned a little bit, is at the perfect angle for the laser, so it actually acts or reflects off the mirror and goes into another feature, and so it gives them a point over there, not necessarily where they're standing. And they're like, why'd all these points show up over here? And it's like, were you anywhere near glass, or was your glass pointing at something else? And it's if you don't know about it and you see it for the first time, the machine's broke or something's happening. And it's like, no, it's your angles. It's all just how you're using
it. You did it. It's your fault.
They don't like hearing that.
It was the loose nut behind the.
It's true. No. So what qualifications would you seek in a new hire? Like somebody, say they went through GGI and they got their certificate, or we grew into a bachelor's or PhD program. What level of education are you looking for somebody to come into NGS?
Bachelor's is fine, master's is fine, and a PhD would be fine. But obviously, we're bachelor's. We have a lot more positions for entry level. It's a lot easier to hire in the entry level. There are intern programs that we can cycle them through from GGI over, get them a couple of summer exposures to get them an idea of what we do. And then bring them in as a new hire. The new hire path is a lot easier.
Yep.
So recent grad used to be, I think they continue to morph them, but still recent hires are almost invariably easier to hire in, even at the master and PhD level. But masters and PhD levels are necessarily hired in at a higher level, ZP3, ZP4 type of level. And as you start to hire into those more specialized fields, or from higher level of training, it necessarily requires more money and more justifications. Exactly. It gets a lot harder to hire in people at the ZP4 level. They're like, why can't you just take one of your ZP3s and send them advanced training or fill in the blank? Right. And then there's nothing wrong with that either. Again, the other side of it is maybe we hire in one of your graduates with a bachelor's degree, and then we train them and we send them someplace else. Or we hire in somebody from OSU with a bachelor's degree and we send them to you and they get a master's degree. And
they work their
The
way.
idea,
Yeah,
though, is,
exactly. Yeah.
yeah, just to continue to revolve around and get that advanced training in there and take them up to the next echelon as part of their promotion path. Because, I mean, we have a number of positions. There's within the spatial reference system division, I'll use that as an example because that's where a lot of this is concentrated.
Right.
We have Opus analyst and cores analyst.
Yep.
So it's, it's what's in the name type of thing. But cores is all about our continuous operating reference stations. The NOAA cores network are all those receivers, of which we actually own 40, and the other 1,800 belong to other groups. A lot from Minnesota, by the way.
Yeah. We're special. We like knowing where things are or setting up where that goes.
It keeps moving too.
Exactly.
But all of that has to be processed. Sometimes when somebody does a patch to their network, they update and they put their patch in. Well, it messes everything up. We had that like with Kentucky one time. They went through, they did their patches on all their receivers at the same time. They all crashed at the same time. They lost the entire Kentucky network.
Wow.
But that was a red flag. And we had a cores analyst who went, holy Toledo, all the cores in Kentucky just went down. Gee, let's go back and look at the site info file and see what happened. Oh, they patched them all. And they went back to the operator and said, you got a problem. Yep. But that's what the cores analyst's job is, to kind of look at the data, understand the data, massage the data on a daily basis, if you will. Make sure that we have confidence in the data that we're receiving, that we're archiving, because that data that we use for the cores data, when we collect that, you went out in the field with your receiver and you collected your information, you come back in the office. So then we take that information we collected at the same time in cores and in and around your area,
right,
to export with your data, and that's what Opus processing is.
Exactly.
So sometimes you have a problem with the way your data were collected or which cores you selected. You have a problem maybe in your Opus processing, because it tumbles out and you go, oh, your Opus software is wrong, or your cores data are wrong. And you're like, well, that's when the Opus analyst comes in and goes, let's take a look at what you did. And it's not in a bad way. It's there to be helpful and help them work through it. And sometimes there are issues. We've had some where some of the cores, if you use one cores, you get one solution, and you use another cores, you get a different solution, and they can be off by 10 centimeters. Just because some of the core stations have issues.
Yep.
And those are, when we find them, we black flag them, we kind of remove them from operation, say, you don't use these when we're doing Opus processing, that type of thing. And then the cores team goes back in and they're like, what's wrong with this? And then that's okay. It's a positive indication of a problem. You can remove it from the queue, not let anybody else use it while you examine it and solve, hopefully, the problem. That's what you're going to do. And then we also have a next higher tier, what we call orbiteers. And it's not just that you're on the ground and now you're in space. One of the products we generate are orbital mechanics for those satellites. Yep. And now not just for GPS, but for the others as well. We need to know where those things are. We've got the ground control, we've got the satellites. Remember, your positions are derived from those satellites. So knowing at that time. Exactly. And that's why it's critical that we do these calculations. We do orbital calculations for those satellites.
Yep.
When the Air Force sends its WGS-84 signal up, it's predicting where it thinks it'll be for the next 6 hours.
Yep.
And they're pretty good. Again, though, they're in the WGS-84 system, so only GPS. And it's a projected system. So when they're sitting there sending their signals down to you, it's from what they got their last inject, and it's what the signal it's sending down to you is where it thinks it is.
Yep.
Not where it knows it is. It says, I think I'm here. And therefore, your position from me is this. So yours is a derived position from that estimated position. That's why we do post-processing. We sit there and say, okay, we took all the signals we received. We know where the ground control are. So we're going to reverse it. We're going to say, if we know where the ground control are and we know where we think we know where the satellites are, we're going to refine that. We're going to refine our position on the ground and refine the satellite's position. And we're going to do that for its entire orbit so that we know exactly where the satellite was. Right. So that when you received at this time the signal from that satellite, we know exactly where it was. So that when we start post-processing in Opus, your position, you now know where the satellite were, where the cores were, and now we can figure out much more accurately where you were.
Exactly.
And in that way, you get a better position. So understanding orbital mechanics and all those types of things are necessarily the higher tier that we're looking for, and necessarily at a higher pay level for the orbiteers, because you're doing more work. You're doing more specialized work. Cores analysts, I'm not at all saying anything against them. Those are our ZP3s. Those are our hardcore workers, and we have a bulk of them because most of the work is about cleaning up the data that are at those stations on the ground.
Exactly.
But we also have some orbiteers who one of the things we do with those orbits, we provide them to the International GNSS service.
Yep.
We say, here are all the orbits where we think all the satellites are. And then they take ours and they take a bunch of others and they meld them together and say, well, this is where we think they all are based on your analysis and everybody else's. And those become the official ITRF or IGS orbits that everybody, if they go to the IGS and they download, they get them.
Yep.
We provide them that input. And every few years when they devise a new ITRF, we provide them the input. We do a reprocessing of all of our data. We hand it to them. We say, this is where we think all of our ground stations were and the satellites. They take all that information, they tumble it together to come up with an IGS solution, which contributes to the IGS, the VLBI, the SLR, and the DORIS all come together to make the International Terrestrial Reference Frame.
Yep.
And then with that fixed, and they back it out and say, here's where the IGS then would be, because we all receive our signals. We're not getting VLBI or DORIS or SLR, although that may be coming on the horizon.
Someday. No.
But for now, we're only getting GNSS signals.
Yep.
And so we say, okay, if you're getting GNSS signals, then here's the IGS reference frame, and then here's your position in it based on all of the other information that we have, and we can define accurate and precise positions for you through time, wherever you're collecting your information.
And see,
So,
by the way,
that's a lot of skills.
It's a lot of skills. It's a lot of knowledge to have, and even at its most basic, it's still like your brain's got to be on compute mode. Like you're not doing this, half awake. Because
Well, and the other side of it then is you can imagine with the cores analysts, it's knowing something about the receivers and the antennas, and knowing about the patching, and knowing something about what could go wrong.
Yep.
Having done it, maybe being in the field, being a surveyor is sometimes a good thing, because that's why we were able to bring in surveyors, because they can look at things and kind of go, this looks like somebody, they didn't put the antenna on, or they miscalibrated, or they didn't get the rod height, or
exactly.
fill in the blank, or they took the default rod height. That happens sometimes where there's like, like they say, oh, it's 2 meters. Well, okay. And unless you actually measured when you set up the tripod and you got that actual measurement to the face center,
yep.
If you just take the default, oops.
Yep.
And that happens.
Right.
But that's why I said it's
okay.
No, I was going to say, and that's why it's critical that we have those kind of skills. And that's why it's easy to bring in somebody who's got a surveying background. It's nice to have a geodesy background, but even somebody with a surveying background could look at that and go, okay, I know what happened here.
Something's off.
Yeah, and they can figure it out. But you want to have the higher math skills and things like that if you're going to be the orbiteer and if you're going to move into those type of positions. So there's a lot of that goes on.
What I was going to say out there too, a caveat in what you were saying there, because I've actually experienced it when I was with the Park Service. When you go out and you're GPSing on the fringes of the coast, right? When you run an OPA solution against it, you might not get it because you're not actually within the coverage, or you're right. Just outside the boundary. So don't freak out. It's not you. It's not the system. It's the fact that you just don't exist outside that boundary for a second.
And there is usually a boundary that they apply, because we're only supposed to process it within our boundary. That's one of the things we're looking at too. And particularly as we roll out the modernized NSRS, we're talking to the Canadians and we're saying, hey, can we use some of your CACs? Because they already use some of our cores.
Yep.
So if we start exchanging information and we have information across the boundary, then this should be a smooth transition. If they're using the North American Terrestrial Reference Frame, and so are we use the same deformation model, and we're using a consistent set of controls data, then as you transition over a boundary, it should be invisible to you.
Should be nothing.
And the same applies into Mexico. It gets a little different, as you go into the Caribbean islands, because you're only going to get there by either flying or taking a ship. So
yep.
You're not going to have the driving problem.
Yep.
But still, it's nice to have that extra information. There are stations that are on Cuba.
Yep.
Cuba is actually on the North American plate.
Yep.
It's in the Caribbean region, but if you look at the plate boundaries, it's on the North American plate. Exactly. So that information, if we had those stations, say in Cuba, would be outside the conterminous United States, outside of the landmass, would provide control so that if you're at that shoreline, you have outside data that you can rely on to try and refine your positions, even right up to the shoreline.
See, now you guys just got to find somewhere like by Cape Cod. That's where I was. And that's why we always ran into the issue, because there is nothing else other than wide open water. Bermuda. I would love the antenna to reach that far. That'd be awesome. Yeah. What professional? Okay, so say I'm a geodesy student, or say I'm somebody in geomatics. I've just watched this video. Dan has blown my mind. Everything. I'm fascinated. I want to know more about this. What journals do I go to? Which ones will give me the the wherewithal to test my mental like cognition for understanding geodesy at a deeper level?
Well, the most rigorous one, as per usual in our field, is journal geodesy.
The journal,
Um, journal geodesies, but I can tell you right now that a lot of the things that get published in journal geodesy tend to be theoretical. They're very abstract, and I mean, it's hard, or if you're already in the field, to follow what's going on in journal geodesy. Entering into it as a new argument, it's really pretty much into the deep end really quickly.
Okay. So how about a step back? Like,
a step back, I would go Journal of Geophysical Research, AGUs, JGR. There's also a Journal of Geodetic Science and Surveying, Journal of Geodetic Surveying, I think it was, JGS.
Is there any?
So that.
Oh, go ahead.
No. And step back from that, I would say things, I mean, you got a number of surveying mags. Salus is starting to come back and be a little more progressive in terms of trying to get a lot of these type of articles pulled in. ASCE, Journal of Surveying Engineering. Those are going to be good. More again. Now you're getting into the nuts and bolts, practical. We how do you do this thing? Not the
geodetics versus theoretical geodetics kind of a thing.
Yep.
But and I think it's a good range, right? Like you get yourself into it. Well, for instance, you wouldn't jump into economic geology in your undergrad as a geologist, because you would be, what is a primary, secondary, and tertiary mineralization of biotite. And you're like, oh, wow, we got into sericite and then phalogopite. You don't know these things. You don't even know the chemical formulas or what's at play when it happens, kind of a thing. Well, for the listeners or those that are thinking about this, say math people, they're, this, no offense against the mathematics industry. Math is great. Math is fun. But much like I always argued on the geology side with chemistry, I can't put math in real life other than things like, my banking account or something like that. Versus when it comes to geodesy, now I'm looking at the environment, I'm watching things change. It's application, it's tangible. That's actually, I got better at chemistry when I learned.
Some people like math. No,
exactly.
Some people do like math because it's pure and there's only one answer. And, there's a lot of, it's a problem. It's a solve. The problem is solved, and you go through it and you get to the right answer. And it's like putting a puzzle together. So in an abstract sense, I do see where it appeals to a lot of people. Math can appeal to a lot of people.
Exactly.
That have that particular desire. But if you want to go out in the field, there's not much field work you do for math.
Exactly.
In geodesy, yes, there's a lot. I mean, we're sending people up to the Great Lakes this summer. They're going to go out and they're going to survey in all the water level stations and all the benchmarks surrounding them. And they're going to measure with GNSS, and they're doing leveling up there at the same time. And we're going to calculate where everything's located so we can update and have the International Great Lakes Datum of 2020 rolled out. And then that's going to be practically used because people are going to navigate and do all that, and it has to be maintained. But in the meantime, geodesists got to go out in the field and collect GPS and do things in the field and do field work and enjoy the outdoors and things like that. So, I mean, it's if there's an outdoor aspect to it, there's a lot of appeal to it. There's plenty of white tower, ivory tower sitting in there doing all the other things if you want to be that way. A lot of the data gets processed, has to be brought back, and the handle gets cranked back at the office. But there's a lot of field observations that go on as well. And there's a lot of work that has to happen in the background. The people, the cores analysts, they don't typically go out in the field. Sometimes they do, particularly if we're helping to install or maintain one of our own stations. Then maybe, the cores branch chief may select a few people to take with him and take out in the field to do stuff. But for the most part, you're receiving and processing data back at the office, and it's all coming to you. And you have to be able to visualize what might have gone wrong, if something went wrong, and pull it all together and archive it and just keep track of it and build all these files up to maintain them for the use for people who want to do opus processing, or down the road when you want to sit there and say, we're going to have to reprocess all this data. So we need a 20 or 30 year history to go back and build all this so that we can do the next international terrestrial reference frame. So there's a lot of that goes on. And again, a lot of that tends to be done in the office, and you don't necessarily go out in the field. So there's something for everybody.
Drink coffee and just watch a computer kind of blink away.
Or, as I say, I mean, so there's something for everybody.
Exactly.
Certainly, if you were interested in going in the field, we have a field observations branch. Those guys are almost all surveyors, and they go out and they do GNSS observations in the field. like you did. But we also collect the data and bring it back, and somebody has to look at it and purge it and clean it and make sure it's safe to use and it's accurate and ready for people to use for other applications.
Exactly. Well, and like you're saying, you need both sides, right? And I think one thing where, from my background and being on the field side more, was the fun of it is that when the GPS is sitting there ticking away, if you're letting it sit for 48 hours, you got to find something to do for 48 hours. So, and you just got to be around just in case anything goes wrong with it. And I've come back to see GPS or repeater
and walk away.
If sprout legs walk away, or in my case, I'm out there doing a survey and I have a repeater giving me position off of I'm doing a base rover survey, repeater giving me position, and all of a sudden I lose position, or my rover loses connection with everything. And I'm like, what's going on? Like, how did this happen? And we're in sand dunes, right? Well, the repeater had wind, went over. If you freak out and you lose track of what's going on and you're not able, well, if you get easily perplexed, now you have a problem. If you think, oh, I should go check my repeater, even though you're 3 miles up the shore, guess what you do? Hike down and find out your repeater's fallen and set it back up and 3 miles back out.
I know, but that's it. But that's because you knew enough to recognize what the symptom was and go, I think I better go, it might have fallen over. And it's the same thing. People in the office have to know enough about setting the field equipment up to know what could have gone wrong. And the people in the field have to know enough about what they're doing to make sure that they're not creating a systematic problem for the people in the office.
Exactly.
It goes both ways. You have to have the cross training. You have to have both sets of skills, whether you go into doing the field work and collections, or you're just going to sit in the office and collect and process the data. You still need to do both. And then every now and again, we'll have we probably won't do one for a while, but we were doing geode slope validation studies where we're going out, we're trying to collect leveling, GBNSS, really high accuracy information and deflections of the vertical, and doing everything we could possibly do along these 200-kilometer long transits.
Yep.
And we were doing that because we were really trying to understand the potential field of the Earth in that region as accurately as possible, because we want to compare it to our geoid model and see if it fits. And the other reason we go 200 kilometers is because generally the satellite models with the GRACE gravity field can go down to about degree 100, which is about 100-kilometer wavelengths.
Oh, nice.
So going 200 kilometers means you can capture a couple of wavelengths of the long wavelength signal from the satellite model. And then all the airborne data are kind of stapled to that. And then all the terrestrial data are stapled to that. So it's all fits to the satellite gravity field model.
Yep.
So if you make a terrestrial survey that's 200 kilometers long, you should be able to sample something that is sensitive, actually, even to the satellite gravity field models. But the point of that is you want to get as long a line as possible so you can compare the geoid, and you're looking to see is the slope of that surface. You know, there may be a bias in there, depends on which geopotential surface you pick, but you're looking at the slope. Once you remove a bias between them, do they match? How closely do they match? So that's the geoid slope validation studies, and we did 3 of them. But we collected a lot of GNSS information, and we didn't just collect them along the lines of off diagonal. We did a whole bunch of things, and we were trying. We flew over it with an aircraft. We did all sorts of things because we were oversampling that line. We really wanted to have every piece of information we can at the same time, or roughly at the same time, to make sure we can understand it very well. Part of that is because right now, NGA is going to go out there with one of their new meters, and we're going to have one of our new meters, and we're going to go out and we're going to hit parts of that old line. Yep. Because we know exactly what happened on that old line, and it's all internally consistent. So it's a calibration line for us. So we can take out new meters and run down these lines and test them and see how they perform.
Exactly.
So it's good. I mean, we've got a good set of calibration lines for testing geopotential monitoring as well as the geometric monitoring. And that is something to emphasize too. Geometric versus geopotential. It's good to have skills in both. I mean, my background is geopotential field. But I ended up as chief of spatial reference systems division, so I learned a lot more about geometric there. So that's why I'm chief geodesist, because I know both sides of it. But the geometric is almost entirely the GNSS signals and all that, and it's geometric because it's geometry, 3D geometry, you know, and all that, the spherical geometry. But it is still geometry, and it is not necessarily a true reflection of what's going on with the Earth. There's only a rough first order magnitude. We describe the reference ellipsoid fits the mass of the Earth, okay, and the general shape with the flattening, but that's it. It's a good approximation, but it's good enough for a lot of the processing. It's internally consistent. It's easy to obtain and all of that. But again, water doesn't flow downhill normally because of ellipsoidal heights. It flows downhill according to the Earth's gravity field. And that's
Exactly.
where the geopotential is separate from the geometric. So there's a geometric side and the geopotential side. And there's going to be a lot of work that goes into the geopotential side and improving and understanding NAPGD 2022, calibration against different water level sets, rivers, the ocean coast, the Great Lakes, flat water surfaces, Salt Lake for that matter.
Yep.
Anything that's flat that we could say, this water surface should be at an equipotential surface. I don't know which one, but I know it should be consistent. So when I calculate it, I should get the same height across that whole thing, a dynamic height, which is a water height. And it should be the same height all the way across that lake. You know, maybe on the Great Lakes, there might be a little bit of a slope because the water is draining.
Yep, exactly.
So, but it shouldn't be like a foot or something like that, or, you know, maybe a few inches. I mean, over the Great Lakes, I'm sure there's going to be a drawdown at the mouth.
Exactly.
But still, it should be pretty flat. So the dynamic height or the equipotential value should be the same. So it's a different set of skills than on the geometric side. But if you know something about both, then you're really in a position to take on a lot of jobs that might require you to know something about both.
And I think that's the fascinating part, especially as you were talking through that, is well, especially in the merging of everyone, right? The field person and the office person. There's something for everyone. And so job security, which people often worry about, if I go and do a job, will I be outcast by somebody else with better skill, whatever? It's like, no, we need everybody we can, because there's a lot of stuff happening here. There's a lot of moving parts. And if we don't work lockstep with each other, we're not doing anything. And much of what you were saying about geopotential versus geometric is exactly that. You got to know a little bit about both sides, or you got to know a lot about both. Sometimes, depending on where you make it Chief Geodisist, I bet you would have to know a lot about both. But it is
mile wide and an inch deep.
Mile wide and an inch deep. But it is one of those things where you get into it and it becomes more fascinating, because you never stop finding out something new about your industry, or you never stop finding out, oh, I never thought about it that way. Oh crap, there's a whole other information set I need to uptake to bet. Well, like you were saying, you know, there's a
you also have in case you say you come into it from the geometric side.
Yep.
And you do it for 5 or 6 years and you start to burn out. You've had enough of it. You can go back and get advanced training and get geopotential skill sets.
Exactly.
Because we expect that you're going to access the geopotential using geometric.
Yep.
But really, you know, you're going to go out, you get the GNSS, make your observation, apply the geoid model,
yep,
the geopotential model, and come up with the geopotential datum values. But then you got to do the analysis in the geopotential and understand all of that. And that's an entirely different set of skills. So if you came into one area and you've had enough of it and you want to move on and do something different, you don't have to leave the field entirely. You can change your emphasis and go and do something different and still have a good time at it. Exactly. And you could pull all of that together and go into yet another field. Say you wanted to go work at DOT, and DOT needs to have people who are smart in geodesy, and they need to understand on the geometric and the geopotential side, because you got to peak the roads so that the water flows off, and you have to understand all of that.
Yep. Yep.
You have to have all of that information pulled together so that you can still say, you know, do the precision navigation for the Department of Transportation. So you could take these skills and you can shop around and you can do different things and not feel like you're trapped in a dead-end job doing the same thing. Exactly. Maybe you started in it and you become like, well, now what? Maybe, you know, and to be quite honest, different generation than us. There are a lot of people out there, they shop, they'll do that type of a path where they go out, they'll do a job for a period of time.
Yep.
They go maybe get advanced training and they'll do a different job. And then they go to a different agency and do yet a third job and gain different skills. And they build skills into a resume so that they continue to leapfrog to the next job. And they may end up cycling back and coming back to us. But that's a path, a roadmap to, you know, gaining the appropriate skills to advance in a career, but not necessarily at the same agency. But if we have it mapped out so that all these different needs are out there and the path to forward is enabled for all of them, then you can facilitate the flow of people between the different agencies and still advance them and keep them interested in the job and continuing to move forward.
Well, I think that's a great message to them, because you're not, in doing that, you're not like switching from, well, you know, geology to business or something like that. You're literally able to keep an idea of what's going on, albeit if you burn out of the thing entirely, wow. But that's, there's always something fascinating, and albeit that might not be the one thing you're interested in anymore or at that time, there's always another option to move into. It's so diverse just within the fields, and we need everybody in all is surveyors alone, right? Like Rhode Island, the average age is 65. If you
Yep.
don't like geodesy, but you want to do geomatics in a way, or geometric in a way, or cadastral, we still need people at that level. We still need people working in those fields, because they help define a whole other side of things that are just based off of this. But knowing this isn't going to hurt you in those fields. So,
Nope. And, you know, and the thing is we've had a couple of people that have gone into different, what might seem like totally vastly different fields. They went into like IT security.
yep,
That's because, keep in mind what I said back at the beginning when we were talking about the different training things to get into, linear algebra and least squares adjustments. Why? Because of the sheer volume of data you're going to be looking at. Even on the geophysical side, you're talking millions of data points, and it all has to be ground together into some type of harmonic model to describe the Earth's gravity field.
right.
And all of that requires some type of an adjustment, a least squares adjustment. There's a lot of data that has to go in. You have to turn a crank on it. Well, guess what? That's data science. If you are talking about manipulating and working with a lot of data and are organizing all that data, all the spatial data points that we're putting into our database, that's data science. So right there, even if you got bored with that, you can go right into data science. You can go into the IT side of the house and just worry about the data and not how it's derived or any of the math behind it. You can just manage that portion of it. So there's lots of ways where we find people that come in and then they go out and maybe they do something that's related to it. And don't get me wrong, you know, we had a number of people that have done things like that, and it's helpful because when they go into the data science and they're worried about security and all that, they still remember why we're collecting the data. It's not just some abstract thing for them. They understand it's critical to our mission to do this.
Right.
So they try and find a way to success for you rather than like, oh, sorry, you can't do that. The rules don't permit it.
Exactly.
They're like, well, let's work with this and see what we can do to find a way to make it work within the rules so that you can accomplish your mission. And that's good because they have that background. They came from our area, they understood our area, but they've moved on to something different, and they found it's constructive for them because they're doing something different, but it's also helpful for us because it takes and broadens them and puts them in other areas. They could go into the Army Corps of Engineers and be worried about levees and all that, but they know a lot about the geometric side and the geopotential side and know how those water surfaces are supposed to be measured and conform and what the concerns would be. So they may take on a different job, but with that kind of a background, they bring into it enough to say, okay, this is how I would do my job, this new job better, because I have all this other information that underpins all of that.
Exactly. And
I
that
was just going to say that gets to what we kind of opened with, is that the geodesy underpins everything.
exactly.
The geodesy and positioning and measurement is all critical to pulling all these different elements together and saying, you know, whether you're observing this or you're observing that, you all have to be in the same framework and the same reference system so that all this data can be compared. And then it makes it easier to do your job, even if you go into a slightly different field, to understand how the data are supposed to be organized in the first place, to get at the geodetic control that underpins all that geospatial information, the infrastructure under the infrastructure.
Well, next question I got for you, this is getting into the white paper questions, because we more than covered 98,000% of the other ones, which I love it. I honestly think this will be one of those longer videos that we put out. But I think anybody who watches this that didn't know what geodesy was before will now, and or at least have a much better depth to it.
And if you stayed this far, thank you.
The fun part will be with when it goes to NOAA, your folks that will review it. It's like, are they ready for it? Because I can easily see do it. I don't want to call it down all the way to 30 minutes, but that might be just the one for the average viewer. But then we'll open it up and say, this is the extended interview where we really got into it. Okay, questions from the white paper. What does our loss in geodesy or in the geodetic industry leadership mean for our geodetic systems or the geospatial systems?
Well, we kind of touched on that a little bit before, but I'll recap it in that it makes it very difficult to do the things we say we want to do. When we talk about Department of Transportation and autonomous vehicles or floodplain management or coastal resilience, all these things are assumed that you're going to have repeat observations and have a reference system that you can make these observations in to understand vertical land motion, horizontal land motion, absolute accuracy in your positioning of things. If you don't have the staff to do that, it's hard to develop the tools, It's hard to develop all the data sets to manage, and it's hard to do any of the tasks that are required to actually accomplish these things. So coastal resilience, we want to look at INSAR. We want to compare that to GNSS receivers on the ground so that we can use the INSAR imagery to kind of scale the change in the ground position. And that applies at the coast and inland too. So that if you're looking at the land sinking around, say, a river, then you can start to extrapolate from that over time where the river flood zones might start to run into. Right. Same at the shoreline. But all of that entails pulling together a sufficient staff of people that understand all the GNSS, the INSAR, how they all integrate together. And if you don't have the people, then it's not going to work. We have all these visions for things we want to do within the positioning, navigation, and timing community, but we don't necessarily have the staff to realize all these tasks that have to be accomplished. We can sit there and formulate them all and say, these are the things we should be doing. And as I said before, too, the National Academy of Sciences produced 2 papers about 10 years apart, 2010, 2021 or so, just recently. And both of them talk about what you can do with precision geodesy in terms of measuring like the glaciers and ocean levels and land change with respect to the oceans and all these different aspects that are fundamental to some of the fundamental science questions and engineering and societal concerns that are out there. But if you don't have the people to do it, it doesn't matter. You can have a need, but you can't meet the need.
Exactly.
And we can have 30 vacancies, but if I don't have a qualified people to hire, we advertise for positions all the time. We don't get enough qualified applicants to actually fill the positions. Exactly. And we have to turn down and don't get me wrong, the process is improved, but it is still a lengthy process to hire into the United States government.
Right.
So when you get to the end of a hiring stream and you're like, okay, let's see what the applicants are, and you go, none of them are qualified. And you have to start over and change something to try and re-advertise. You just added another 6 months to a year under your hiring process. So that's another that much more that you're doing without anybody in the position.
Exactly.
And as I say, we have a number of positions that we're not funded for, that we can't fill, and it makes it much more difficult to fulfill our missions.
Right.
And it's not just us. They're NASA, NGA, USGS, all of us are experiencing much these same problems. There's just too few people out there to do it. And as I said before, we're hiring in all the professors who used to train students that we would hire. Now we're just hiring the professors, so there's nobody out there to do the training anymore.
Exactly.
That hurts.
It's actually a perfect lead up to the next one. How long do you think it will take to recover from our lack of geodetic professionals or the training gap? Because we know minimum 8 years right now for a PhD. So
I was going to say decades. Seriously, in 10 years, we could probably, it depends on where you call it done. If you start, define done here on the curve, then, 10 years. But if you define done here back to where we were before, then that's a lot more up the power curve, and it's probably more like 20 or more years. Assuming that we fund everything up, we put money into the universities to do this type of research. And some of it can be tangential. Like I said, FOLP is interested in, for DOT is interested in looking at precision navigation and precision and accuracy in terms of navigation, where things are in terms of autonomous vehicles. So you can have transportation, departments at the universities that are focused on transportation and all the vehicles and engineering and all the applications. And you can have them linked to a geodetic program that says, and here's all the infrastructure you need to underpin all of this. As long as those cross linkages are there, and some of that funding comes in not only to pay for the autonomous vehicle studies, but then where do we put the built infrastructure and how do we position it and tie all this so that we can get autonomous vehicles in real-time mode going down the road. We have to identify those opportunities and fund that at a number of universities, institutes, because it can't just be one, it has to be across the board. It helps with the diversity. If we're hiring just in Minnesota, well, I'm sure it's helpful for your people, residents in Minnesota, but it's probably not as helpful to other people and other populations around the country by putting it into a number of universities, and not just Ohio State University either. We're Center for Space Research at Texas, but all the universities, spread it around. You can draw more people in. You got a better chance of somebody coming into a college, because a lot of people walking into college don't know they want to go into geodesy.
Exactly.
They've never heard of geodesy. It would be great if we were getting in the K through 12 spectrum I find it heartening a little bit that at my daughter's high school, they actually have a GIS course that they teach. Oh my gosh, they actually got geo something in the name, granted it's geography, but
Right.
it's more at a GIS. It's still a geographic information systems. So the
Exactly.
concept of geodesy is buried in there somewhere, so that
Exactly.
they understand, hey, when I'm measuring something, it's with respect to something else. There has to be some coordinate system that I'm measuring to. So all of that has to be spread around down the K through 12 level, but then also diversified throughout the universities with funding.
Yep.
I understand you guys don't work for free. You're a business. You need money coming in to justify training students to do these things, to be able to sustain them, to
Right.
send them off to industry who could pick those people up, or to send them to work for the government, or to do any number of other research opportunities.
Exactly. Or
But
go into business and work with Tesla to know what's going on. Exactly. Yeah. Like,
they need those skills and they need to have that opportunity. If there's a robust enough environment to sustain that, then it's possible to do that. And that's where you need somebody like a NASA or some group that's already got the linkages to multiple universities across the country to be able to diversify and put in place a program like that where they can focus on those types of things and bring in the geodetic aspects to a number of different businesses, a number of different industries,
right.
for them to look at it and go, this is important to us. We do need to fund this, or we do need to at least take that into account when we're doing our work, because it's going to impact how we do our job.
Right.
And once they understand it, and that's that outreach and communication, that's that part I told you I like, but that I know it's also hard. Sometimes I hate because people
Yep.
don't get it. But if they understand that it really does underpin what they're doing, and they, in the end, would make their job easier because
Right.
it'd be more consistent and on the same framework, then they would see the need for it. Then those programs get funded, and then you start to matriculate students and bring them through, and you can put them into the industry. They can go start their own business, or they can come work for the government.
Exactly. Yeah.
and help us maintain the whole system. So
Exactly.
that's the key, is trying to get this groundswell. And I think it's got to be a collaboration, cross collaboration between a number of different agencies to make this happen.
Yep.
But it really does require funding from the governmental level, because from what we have right now, we don't have the money in our pockets. We're very stovepiped within NOAA. We're organized by tasks of what we do. We receive money to do tasks, not do the research, not fund that type of thing. NASA's more in that lane, and they got a lot more latitude in the way they can sign agreements and things of that nature.
Yep.
There's an expectation that NASA will lead this type of efforts. NASA's mission, though, is not to just do that in perpetuity. It's like the National Science Foundation. They put in all those wonderful receivers as a part of PBO and all these other things. The problem for them is that they don't want to do operations. They're to do research.
Yep.
National Science Foundation
Yep.
is there to do science, not operations. And so all of those stations that were put in as part of PBO, they're trying to figure out who they want to give them to, because their budget is going into maintaining those things that people are using to do all sorts of operational things, but they're not supposed to be doing that. They're supposed to hand it to some other entity and say, here, you take ownership of these and responsibility for maintenance and the maintenance
you get to pay for this. Yep.
that's where funding would come in. Again, you
Yep.
don't just take on that responsibility, then you take on the O&M. You have to take care of all of this that goes into maintaining that network, the staff to maintain it, everything else that goes into that network. But it takes it off of NSF's plate and says, okay, now NSF can go back to saying, now we're going to fund science again, which is the mission of the National Science Foundation. And NASA's in the same mode. They want to fund research, but eventually they want that to transition into something that is productive, that can come back around to either help the taxpayer, industry, or the government agencies do their jobs better.
Yep.
So they want that, eventually they want to hand that off. They don't want to have it in perpetuity. Although the training portion, if they can keep that up and sustain that and become something that can be something they can sustain in terms of different training opportunities. And NASA is going to say, okay, well, first we'll train them this. And once that's up and running and transition off to maybe the Department of Transportation, then we're going to start this other area. We'll look at INSAR and we'll look for water flows, and we'll transition, vertical land motion, maybe to USGS. And so they're going to be shifting topics, and that's what NASA does. They shift their focus a little bit each time, but throughout all of that, they're funding institutes and universities to do this research, and just shifting the research priorities, but they're still funding them. They provide the opportunities for these things to happen. And in the meantime, the universities continue to crank out people that have these skills, that they can come out into industry or come into the government and basically sustain the geodetic workforce throughout the United States instead of us having to constantly import them from other countries. And that's been harder of late because we've kind of restricted the number of people who can come in that might have those technical chops. And so we're not necessarily gaining those people from the outside who can become naturalized citizens that we can hire. Exactly. Because we are in the mode, we cannot hire a non-U.S. citizen. I can only hire U.S. citizens.
Well, no, that's exactly it. And I mean, from a point of national security, that's important. But from the other side, you know, you guys want us to pull from what pool? Like, where do you think we're getting these guys? Like, do you want us to pull somebody off the street and say you're a geodesist now? Because that's just detrimental, potentially.
I know, and that's exactly it. That's recruitment. That's part of it too. And that's why I said outreach and communication.
Yep.
It's not just you. It has to go down to the K through 12 level. You have to start it in early. You have to say when you start looking at career paths, you got to get it in at the high school level at the very least. You have to move that forward, and you have to have that as a viable path in college. Yep. Because a lot of people, even if you don't have it in high school, I can tell you for a fact with a lot of young people going into college, they don't know necessarily what they want to do.
Exactly. So yep. I was right there.
What you need is right there when they're coming in, you need counselors at school who say, well, did you hear about this thing called Geodesy? There's a whole program over here where we're paying people. Maybe there's some subsidies. Maybe they say, you know what, you want to get a bachelor's in geodetic science? We've got a program over here, and NASA's sponsoring some internships or fellowships or scholarships for people to come in and study into these programs and matriculate with degrees in them. And maybe go on and do master's degrees, and then we have specific research where we pay the professors to do this research, and they can bring the students in. Or maybe they pay the professors to you have assistantships for undergrads. I don't know. It depends on what the school allows. I don't know that part. But what I do know is that the school's not going to do anything unless there's some funding to enable all of that, and there has to be a source for that, and that's where groups like NASA and NSF would come in. But as I said, NSF's kind of hamstrung right now because they got all these GNSS receivers they own that they would love to hand off to somebody, but that has to be organized first to say these are critical national infrastructure that underpin all the other infrastructure that we're doing. They need to become somebody's responsibility for maintenance.
Yep.
Sticking our hand up when we put our hands down. Let's stick our hands up to the NDS to take that on at all. But it is critical national infrastructure, needs to be maintained somehow.
Somehow by someone that is capable of doing it without funding issues or any of those. Yeah.
Exactly. That has a significant portion of funding allocated to them to do that type of work. I don't know the mechanism for it on that one. It's still very much open to debate, but it needs to come off NSF's plate because that is not NSF's mission. That I do know solidly. Exactly. That is not the NSF mission. And it's hamstringing because a good chunk of the budget that comes in goes right out to taking care of that network.
Right.
And they're like, we would like to pay scientists to do, basic research, which is the mission of the NSF. But right now they're tasked with taking care of this network, which is critical to a lot of things that are going on, but needs to be placed somewhere else. Another part of the government, again, not necessarily volunteering, no NGS, exactly. But I'm saying
yep,
it has to be taken off their plate, go somewhere. It needs to be maintained because we use a lot of those stations. So do other groups to do the positioning and the measurements that we need to do as a part of all of the geodetic infrastructure. So they're critical in that component. So, but that path forward is not clear. But if that were to clear up, then between NSF and NASA, then they would both become funding mechanisms to try and enable geodetic research or geomatics research so that people can look at it, not just from, I got a degree in geodesy, I got a degree in geomatics and I'm focused on the Department of, autonomous vehicles and transportation industry, or I'm focused on, water flow and floodplains and things of that nature. And whatever you're doing, but with the underpinnings of geodesy still there.
Exactly.
And that's funding in place to do that.
And I think we hit on it, so I might not let you use the funding issue as a thing. Well, the funding being a huge part of all this, right? But what do you think the weakest link in USA's geodesy is right now? Is it specifically funding? Is it lack of knowledge? Is it, or what's the greatest threat? Or you don't have to answer.
Yeah, this is to get into policy somewhat, which is why I'm a little reluctant to say much. Honestly, it's a little bit of everything. There are no courses that are graduating, but they're not graduating because there's no demand signal, because there's not enough money flowing into it. And there's not enough money flowing into it because at least there's from my point of view, there's a perception that geodesy isn't important anymore,
Yep.
that we don't see the need for it. And this is where, in some parts, it's maybe a failure on my part as chief geodesist in outreach and communication to try and convey this at the highest levels, that there is this need at the highest government levels, that this needs to be a part of budgetary planning, that it needs to come down and be put into NASA NSF budget, that it needs to go out, and because it'll come back to us.
Yep.
Then we start bringing these people back to us. But there's a lot of competing priorities. That's always the problem. And how do you say, well, this is priority, this is a high enough priority that it should be funded, or funded at some level to try and move it forward?
Right.
That's difficult. And it is. It's hard to say over everything else. But, it's one of those things, well, but it's an inertia thing. We've gotten by with what we have for so long. Why do we need to change? Because at some point it breaks.
Exactly.
And then it becomes a catastrophe. When your O-ring blows out is not the time to suddenly say, maybe we want to invest in safety culture a little more.
Yeah. Right.
Then it's too late.
Exactly. Well, that's exactly the next question. Do you think that it's too little too late for this industry to save geodesy without having to, well, if everyone, I don't know what the average age is at the NGS, but if everyone's getting close to retirement age, what comes after the last guy leaves that was a trained geodesist? Last guy or woman?
You're doing fairly well, but keep in mind what I said earlier about eating our seed corn.
Exactly.
Dan Jones is brilliant, and I have every confidence that Rick Bennett will be too. We're bringing in others, and we have a lot of others that we brought in.
Yep.
The problem is we're, as I said, eating our seed corn. They're not training any more geodesists. Oops. Exactly. We're not hurting now as an agency, but what it's done is that's bringing on the train wreck that much the faster, because now there's nobody coming through the pipeline to come to us to help train more people. So I don't, that's the part where now the potential is looming a little more closely. But again, there are a number of academics that are out there. There are a number of retirees that could go back into the industry. They're relatively young and could go in and be either consultants or stand into the programs. You looked at that paper, that white paper, the number of people on there, like former director, former chief for Spatial Reference Systems Division, former chief for Geosciences Research Division. They're former, so get me, they're Joe public now, so they're allowed to vent their opinions because they're my boss.
No longer on anyone's dime. Yeah.
But that said, but there are a lot of professors on there too. Scripts. There's a whole host of people that are involved in the industry. There's still plenty of professors out there. There's still plenty of viable programs that could be plussed up if there were enough people involved in them.
Exactly.
And, when they stood up the Geodesy program originally at OSU, Dick Rapp was one of the first graduates from the program. He kind of matriculated in 1961, about 4 years after this thing called Sputnik.
Which is funny because we had to instantly get into space because guess what? We're not the first up there.
The geodesy was important, and that's why they started tracking satellites and understanding and doing all that. Understanding the Earth's gravity field really suddenly was important.
Exactly.
So, and it takes a Sputnik kind of moment to say, you know what, we've reached a point where we really do need to do this, and it's what it took. They stood up the program. They brought a lot of academics over from Europe, that Ivan Mueller and several others that knew a lot about geodesy. They brought them over. They trained a bunch of students. Those students matriculated. They became professors themselves in full right.
Yep.
And they started teaching other students.
Yep.
So you're right. It take about 8 years, and then they're going to take a while to grow into their job. But that's why I said a couple decades. If once you get that first crop of students in and they start teaching and they get funding, then they start bringing in students, and now those students can start to come back into the industry and into the government and into these positions.
Exactly. Yeah.
That's 8 times 2, 16, 20 years.
Yep.
Yeah, you see what I was saying now about it taking a couple of decades.
Well, no, and that's exactly it. And that's why I also wanted to, I was focusing on that question, because it's like, is it too little too late? If at the average age is 40 years, right, they're going to be hitting retirement age, and now what happens when, well
we are kind of shoehorning a few methods around that. We've had some success bringing people. Some of the ones we brought in are younger.
Yep.
I won't speak to anybody's age per se, but I will say that some of them are more in the middle career path.
Yep.
They've got, decades more to go. We've got a lot of younger ones that we just brought in and we're sending back for advanced training. They got their full careers ahead of them.
Exactly.
So we're not hurting as bad. Some of the other groups, and I'm speaking strictly from a geodesy point of view at the National Geodetic Survey, within the National Ocean Service and other groups, you've got water modelers that they've had and experienced a lot of attrition, and they don't necessarily, they experienced the same problem, but they weren't necessarily as successful in bringing in some people to replace them.
Yeah.
So there have been cases where it hasn't been as successful, where they just had a complete brain drain and they're out of luck.
Yep.
We've been fortunate that a lot of our people held on long enough that when new people came in, we transitioned the knowledge. We had the opportunity for knowledge transfer to occur.
Right.
So we have the legacy, we have the longevity. We're able to do that. We've got enough younger people in that as long as we rolled in another crop of people in the next 8 or 10 years, that they would come in behind and in another after them, then we would be in decent shape, I think. And then within NGA, they've experienced a pretty significant brain drain, true.
Yep.
But they also have that program they've already structured where they started hiring people at the entry level, and they're sending them back for advanced training within geodesy, more specifically geomatics. And they're bringing them back in. And so they're gaining that groundswell before their senior people start to retire and age out. So they're starting to do it, but it's only in fits and starts in bits and pieces. It's not a concerted across the government effort. And it's a good start, but it needs to be replicated in other places across the whole government. There needs to be significant funding put into it. DOD's got some deep pockets, but they don't have, they're not infinite.
Exactly.
And they can put a certain amount into this particular program, and they're investing in it. But there's a reason that, the language in that article, that white paper by Beavis et al., targeted a lot of the national security concerns, because NGA has been concerned about this, and they talked to the DOD about that. And so that's why DOD is paying for some of this, but DOD can't pay for all of it.
Exactly.
That's not their mission anyway. And it is a mission that the rest of the civilian side of the government should be investing in. The PNT community is more than just the DOD. It's DOT and all the other agencies that do anything with positioning, navigation, and timing are supposed to be engaged in that community and should be supporting it. So there should be a broader whole of government approach here, not just we're going to thrust it on a couple of people and say it's your problem, figure it out. But by the way, we want to ride your coattails and get all the benefits of all this stuff. You don't have to pay for it. No, you really do need to pay for it. You need to come across with pushing for it, lobbying for it, if you will, on the outside. Within the government, they have to push for it, say this is a part of our mission needs. We have to be able to do these things. And we have to say we need these type of things if we're going to accomplish our mission, that much the better. To meet these legal requirements that you've placed upon us to do things like GDA, Evidence Act, Data Act, all these things about how we collect the data, how we make it available, how we make it available to the public and render it in such a way that it is useful and easily accessible. We have requirements that are in there that underpin all of this that have to be met as well. That infrastructure beneath the infrastructure. And that is the part where they have to invest in that as well as all these other things that they can see tangibly are important to them, but they don't understand the invisible part that's beneath all of that is equally important if they're going to do this in a consistent manner.
Exactly. Well, see, you nail all my questions every time too, because the next question is what's the nightmare scenario, and everything you were just talking about. Essentially, if these pieces don't fall together, it all falls apart. And the NGA and the DOD and the civilian side, it all just kind of teeter-totter, well, not teeter-totters, it domino effects right through the whole gamut of things.
Start to crash.
Exactly.
And programs that, that so much money has been put into and efforts that have been made, things that people have come to expect are going to happen will not happen.
Exactly.
They will not happen at the level that they want, or you're going to have like we've been experiencing with these autonomous vehicles, they're going to start crashing.
Exactly.
And, it's not going to be, the AI wasn't smart enough in the onboard computer. No, it wasn't the onboard computer. It was the whole system, the infrastructure that was underneath it, the control infrastructure that was not in place, that we didn't want to pay for. It's like building, putting this wonderful parade on this crumbling road that's been built on a sandbank with no road developed underneath it.
Right.
What could possibly go wrong?
Right. And then everything just falls apart and you're like, wow, didn't expect that. And it's like, yeah, that's not good.
Yeah, actually we did. You just didn't want to hear it.
Exactly.
And then the problem is then what comes next is it becomes tenfold more expensive to fix.
Exactly.
And that's the nightmare scenario. That's when you say, okay, what are we not going to do now that we have to try and fix all this stuff that's no longer working? The infrastructure that we tried to put in place, all the roadways, everything that we tried to build and make smarter and better and faster and cheaper. Well, we maybe made it too cheap and we cut on a couple of corners that we shouldn't have. And now all of a sudden it doesn't work like we expected.
And now it's 10 times more expensive as well, because guess what? Now we have to go back and dig it up and redo
All
it.
the old reestablish the control you should have done in the first place and now put it in correctly.
Exactly. We're really good at learning that lesson. I won't speak specifically about any groups that I've ever worked with, but there's often, oh, money, and oh, we could do it right, or we could save some money. Okay, well,
Ready, fire, aim.
exactly.
Wait.
Exactly. Well, I want to thank you for your time in this interview today, and I want to keep this conversation going, obviously, because it's always riveting. Even from our first conversation when we opened up talking about doing a presentation. Anything, last comments you want to say to future students, folks that are out there about geodesy or anything, or?
Just that it underpins a lot of things and it can lead to a lot of interesting activities. A lot of all these other sciences and all these other engineering and social applications, all these different things really do require geodesy to underpin it all. And it really, even if you get bored with it and you move on to something else, getting an education in it will make you smarter as you go into these other industries, as you start to develop those skills. And I always joke a little bit about, people say, well, what's geodesy do for me? It says, well, when you pull out your phone and you want to figure out how to get to your Starbucks, geodesy is what helps get you there.